Hello there, and welcome back to Tiny Desk Chapel. We're only halfway through the year, and 2020 has already turned out to be quite a tumultuous one. We began with sustained bushfires, concerns about an economic recession, then the spread of a global pandemic that's taken more than 500,000 lives worldwide, and civil unrest over deaths in custody. You'd be forgiven for thinking that the world has been turned upside down. I don't know how you've been feeling, but it doesn't always take things that make the news to turn our world upside down. It could be something a little more personal. I remember back in year 11, I'd been at boarding school and was home for the holidays when my mum and my then stepfather had an argument, a disagreement, that became sustained and difficult enough that it ended in my mother and my two young brothers and I out on the street, walking who knew where, with suitcases in hand. My world had been turned upside down. I didn't know what the next year was going to be bringing. Would I be going back to my school? Would I see my friends again? What about the plans I'd had for the future? Well, I thought to help us reflect upon how to live well when our world's been turned upside down, we'd seek out some ancient wisdom. And I'm turning to the book of Daniel, chapter 1 in particular, where we discover a group of young, well-off, well-educated men that are in a difficult situation. Their world has been turned upside down. And we're going to see how they face their challenge and see whether we can gain some wisdom from it about how to live well in the modern world when our world's been turned upside down as well. And so we read in Daniel chapter 1 from verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of the court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed and quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language of the Babylonians and the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table, and they were trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. And so we meet 4 young men, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They've been taken from their homeland, ostensibly as slaves, to be raised in a foreign land, in the Babylonian court. Their job there is to be assimilated, to learn what it is to be a Babylonian, and perhaps one day to be administrators within the Babylonian Empire. They had lost their homeland. They'd lost their place with their families. They'd lost their places in society. How was it that they would respond when their world had been turned upside down? You can imagine for them that this was more than just a physical relocation. The temple of their God had been sacked. Their city, their capital, had been besieged and destroyed. These were people without a home, but potentially without a hope. As we read through the account in Daniel chapter 1, we see that the way that they coped with this was, in a sense, learning to sail. Now, sailing is being used here as a metaphor, of course, but we all know the power of the wind. You only need to have a look at the coast at the moment to see how the wind can just blow and whip up waves of enormous size just by its sustained breath. Well, there are several ways that we can harness the wind. If you're in a hot air balloon, you use the wind to float along, to go wherever the wind tells you. If you've ever been on a hot air balloon, it's remarkably peaceful, at least in between the blasts of hot air, as the wind just carries you wherever it chooses. There's not a whole lot of control. And sometimes that's how we can feel when our worlds have been turned upside down. That we don't have any control, that we just have to go where the wind pushes us. But sailing is quite different to hot air ballooning. Sailing is about using the wind, harnessing the wind's power to go in the direction you still want to go, to have a goal or a destination in mind. And sure, you will need to tack and you'll need to jive. You won't be able to go straight from A to B, but by choosing to sail rather than just float along, you use the wind to get to where you want to go. Now, of course, to do that, you need to have a direction, a sense of direction. What is it that I want to do? How do I want to get there? We read in Daniel chapter 1 that these 4 young men maintained their sense of direction. Not only did they have the companionship of one another, which is an important thing to rely upon in times of difficulty, but also they had a desire to maintain their identity. See, these were men of God, and they decided that whatever situation they might be in, wherever they might find themselves, that they would be in control of how they responded. See, that's one of the tricks about resilience. It's learning that we can't always choose our circumstances. In fact, we rarely do. But we can always choose how we respond to them. And so whilst they were in this court of a foreign king in a foreign land, they decided to maintain their dignity, to maintain their desire to obey their God. And so whilst they were being provided for by the king at his table, they chose to make a choice, to make a stand of sorts, to sail against the wind. They said, "We're happy to eat from your table, but we would prefer to just eat the vegetables and to drink water." Now, as much as this might seem to be a recommendation for vegetarianism, and I'm not against that, it's actually their desire to stay kosher, to maintain their food laws as part of their identity. For them, their obedience to God was the direction that they wanted to head in. That gave them their destination, something to be tacking and driving towards, whilst the winds of their circumstance blew against them. And so we can learn from them about the ability that we all have to respond to our circumstances. Now, this of course doesn't mean that whatever situation we're in, if we trust in God, that we don't need help. Mental health is not something that suddenly becomes unimportant for people of faith. If we have problems, then we seek solutions for those, just as we would with our physical health. But what they did have was something perhaps that was a little unexpected for the people who had brought them into this circumstance. See, they were perhaps quite used to conquering other nations and showing their superiority by bringing the treasures of their gods into their own temple to say, "See, we have defeated you and your gods, so you must do as we require." And yet they found the fortitude to say, "Hey, we understand that this is our circumstance, but we don't believe that our God has abandoned us, and so we are not going to choose to abandon him." They chose to sail against the wind. What gave them their hope to do that? What was the point? Why not just give up on God if so readily it seemed that God had given up on them? Well, they were holding on to the hope of God's promises. That God had said that this would happen if his people had disobeyed him, that they would end up in this circumstance. And the prophets had warned that this would happen. But the prophets had also said that there is hope for the future, that if the people turn back to God, that they would be restored in their relationship with him. On that night in year 11, as I was walking down the street with my mum and my 2 brothers, it seemed like there was no hope. I do remember glimpsing up into the sky and seeing the moon just shining there, as it always had. Nothing had changed for the moon. And I began to reflect upon the things that hadn't changed, despite the things that had. One of the things I appreciated in that moment was, despite not knowing what my future would bring, I still knew that my relationship with God was secure. That the promises that he made in the Lord Jesus were still just as true, regardless of my circumstances. That I could relate to God, that I had a forgiven relationship with him through his Son. And that whatever might happen in the days or years ahead, there would still be a destination that was secure by faith, through God's grace. That I would end whatever my journey might be with him, in relationship with him and his people forever. This has been of great benefit to me throughout my life and through times of difficulty. As I've said, it doesn't make me or other Christians or people of faith immune to the ups and downs of life. But knowing that there is a promise that you can hold on to that is secure in God, is really important to us at times like this. There's an expression, when in a fix, Philippians 4:6. Philippians is a letter in the New Testament, and chapter 4, verse 6 says this: "Don't be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, bring your requests to God. And the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in the knowledge and love of Christ." What an amazing verse for people in times of difficulty. It's certainly been inspiring to me and inspiring to millions of others when our worlds have been turned upside down. So I hope that can be an encouragement for you at this time when our world seems so topsy-turvy, that you can be thinking about, A, who are the people around you that are supporting you? How are you being of support to them? What are the things that you can still hold on to in times of difficulty? Are they sure and certain? It's great to know that when the world's been turned upside down, you can hold on to the God who made the world and is Lord over all things. In the book of Daniel chapter 1, it reminded the readers of that even though this circumstance had happened to these people, that God was still in control and they could keep their trust in Him. Well, I don't know where you're at in your life at this point in time, but I do hope that Daniel chapter 1 and the rest of Daniel, as we reflect upon it over the next few weeks, can be of encouragement to you about how to live well in a world that seems upside down.